And our first speaker for session 2 is Laura Ligouri. She's director and founder of Mindbridge. Mindbridge is a nonprofit organization connecting psychological and neurobiological insight to nonprofit and government-sponsored humanitarian efforts. Ligouri's interest in the intersection of neuroscience and public engagement emerged when she was a researcher at the Sachs Lab Social Cognitive Neuroscience Laboratory at MIT, where neurobiological research often sought to understand the biological underpinnings of collective victimization, discrimination, and violence, as well as seeking to understand the drivers that ultimately lead to a perception of empowerment. Laura Ligouri.
All right, you guys have been sitting for a long time. How's everybody doing? Good-ish? Let's stand up. Right? Shake out our legs for a second. I need you awake because I have questions for you. Yeah? Take a big breath in. And let it on out. Good. A little bit better? All right, go ahead, take a seat. So what is so special about psychology and neuroscience that this tends to capture our imagination? Yeah, aside from the fact that being able to look at the human brain, the living human brain at an MRI is incredibly cool. Yeah, why have we chosen to dedicate an entire NGO, our Mindbridge, to psychology and neuroscience? Yeah. So before we start to answer that question, we should also take a look at part of our mission statement, humanitarian efforts, and what is it when we think about humanitarian efforts? Today we might think about the ongoing crisis in Syria. Or perhaps we're thinking about ending global poverty. And what both of these have in common is they both come encapsulated within their own sociocultural, economic, and structural constraints. But one really important component tends to be overlooked, and that's the psychological and neurobiological foundation of the people involved. So when we're thinking about, for example, Syria, what are the values, beliefs that underlie the leaders' actions and motivations, right? Why do we do what we do? When we're thinking about ending global poverty, some organizations trying to end global poverty, some NGOs are using self-help groups. Pradhan India is a 30-year-old organization trying to alleviate rural poverty. And for their self-help groups, they focus on a component of empowerment, notably psychological constructs. So again, why do we do what we do? And when we ask ourselves this question, we have to understand what motivates us, and that's comprised of the mind and the brain. So to start to answer that question, that brings us to today's allegory, the rider and the elephant. Okay, so imagine for a moment, you're in your neighborhood, you're walking down the street, you're stopping and looking at the fall foliage when you look in front of you and you realize that walking towards you is a rather large elephant, and atop that elephant is a rider. And after you get over your first shock at seeing an elephant in your neighborhood today in Boston, you realize that that elephant is rapidly coming towards you. Here's the question: who's in charge, the rider or the elephant? The elephant. Most people answer the elephant. And this is a fantastic model coined by Dr. Jonathan Haidt for us to understand the important distinction between our conscious reason part of our brain, the rider, and the vast, unconscious, implicit neurobiological processes at work in our everyday. Yeah? And so in order to emphasize this, let me throw a statistic at you. What would you say if I told you that 40 to 90% of all of our behaviors are unconscious? Some people are nodding, yeah, I could believe that. Even if we go to the low end of that spectrum, 50% of our daily behaviors are unconscious. Half of everything we do is an unconscious process. That's extraordinary. And it tends to highlight exactly why we really want to pay attention to the psychology and neuroscience, most especially when we're trying to create programming and interventions that affect the individual human being. So, still don't believe me? Let's take this to the field. And for that, we're going to travel to Europe, and we're going to look at anti-Roma bias. The Roma, Romani, Sinti are among Europe's largest minority population. They are also prey to widespread and pervasive discrimination, bias, and at times violence. In order to answer this, the EU came up with the Decade of Roma Inclusion in 2005. This was an 80 billion euro initiative, set up to raise the social economic status and inclusion of the Roma minority. Did it work? 2015 came, and some people said that this was successful because it brought the topic of the Roma minority onto the desks of important government officials. However, it failed to raise the social economic status of the Roma minority, and it failed to create the inclusion of the Roma minority among non-Roma communities. So, why didn't it work? What weren't they paying attention to? I'll give you a hint. The elephant, right? A few years ago, I was the lead scientific advisor to the Neuroscience and Social Conflict Initiative, coined by Beyond Conflict. The initiative decided that we were going to try to understand the psychological drivers that underlie anti-Roma bias, and at the helm was Dr. Emile Bruno. So I'm going to stop for a second and talk about discrimination. Now, in our culture and in English, we tend to think of discrimination kind of a monolithic term, right? Discrimination means the unjust or prejudicial treatment of a category of people or thing. But in psychology, discrimination can come up from a lot of different avenues, a lot of different characteristics. It might be how warm or cold I feel towards you. It might be how competent I think you are. It might be that you were born with these qualities and you are never going to be able to overcome them, among others. So when we decided to set up a study, a pilot study in Hungary a few years ago, we threw the kitchen sink at this. There hadn't been a study before to understand the psychological drivers of anti-Roma bias. So we did national surveys. We did focus group surveys. We did behavioral studies, and we even did neurobiological studies. And what we found was that all of these, now, I'm not going to bore you with a lot of science and data and graphs, right? I can bore you with that after the talk, if you like, yeah? But what I found was that these tended to converge onto one aspect of discrimination, and that was dehumanization. So Laura, what's the big deal? Dehumanization just means that I'm treating that person as less than human, right? Let's take another look. The psychological process of demonizing the enemy, making them seen less than human and hence not worthy of humane treatment. This can lead to increased violence, human rights violations, war crimes, and genocide. Genocide. In fact, the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard cited that the Romani people were in a pre-genocidal state. So not only is this a rather large elephant, 40 to 90% of our daily behavior is unconscious, but it was a rather dangerous elephant. But at least now we had more of an idea of exactly what kind of elephant we were dealing with now, right? Now we were a little bit better prepared to start to develop an intervention. Comes to the idea. There was an interesting trend in the data. When we started to look at the data, we realized that respondents to our surveys that tended to answer in more biased or prejudicial ways to the Romani people were young adults as compared to older adults, right? This is incredibly interesting. In the United States, it tends to be the exact opposite trend. But in Europe, it was young adults. So now we had a target. We were understanding that we wanted to develop an intervention that was geared towards young adults. Fantastic. So I had to ask myself, all right, well, I don't want to do a big media campaign. I don't want to just hit them over the head with a bunch of commercials because that just speaks to the writer. I want to do something else. I want to do something that they're going to be interested in, that they're going to be engaged in, that they're going to want to do, right? And I thought, well, what is it that young people tend to spend a lot of time doing? video games. Now I have a confession, yeah? I don't play video games. I don't know anything about video games, not really. And so, but I was really glad that they do. Games for Change is a community and a movement that uses video games towards global social change. And I went to their fantastic conference. They have an annual conference every year in New York City, where I was able to see Never Alone. Now let me tell you, if you have never looked this up, let me just ask, has anybody played this in this room? Oh, yes, there are a couple of hands. I am very excited about that. That's fantastic. Yes, if you haven't played this game, go look it up afterwards. It is a fantastic game, absolutely beautiful, and made only more beautiful by its backstory. The Cook Inlet Native Tribal Council in Alaska was concerned that they were losing their youth, that the youth were no longer interested in engaging with their culture and tribal practices. And so the Native Council had to ask themselves, well, we want an intervention, we want to do something, but what is it that engages youth? What do they spend a lot of time doing? So they came up with the same answer. And they approached a company called Eline Media. And in a true partnership, co-created Never Alone. Now, not only was this game incredibly successful in their communal realm, right, by engaging their youth, to date, it has sold almost 3 million copies worldwide and was heralded as the 2015 Game of the Year. This certainly struck a chord. So I had to ask myself, could a video game with a Roma avatar work to mitigate anti-Roma bias? In fact, literature seems to think so, right? Often when we talk about video games, what we see in the news a lot of the time is how violent video games tend to bring about violent behavior, right? But could we use our powers for good, yeah? Could we use pro-social video games to engender pro-social behavior, right? And a lot of times, these organizations that are trying to bridge the gap between distinct ethnic groups are trying to elicit empathy. Right? And often through the process known as perspective taking. That idea that we heard earlier, that if you hear a story of someone else, you'll come to understand what it feels like to be them and know their experiences as your own. Well, video games tend to take this a few steps further. Not only are you taking the perspective of the character on the screen, but you then become that character, right? All right, perhaps I've played a couple of video games, right? Most of us have played this video game, right? Yeah, so we're playing Pac-Man, and we're psyched, the Pac-Man's eating all the dots, and we're really excited about this, and we're clicking away, and then we realize, oh no, the ghost is gonna come up, and it's gonna get me. Freeze frame. It's gonna get me, right? We project our self-identity onto that character. Not only are we understanding what that character is feeling or experiencing, but we are experiencing them as if they are ourselves. That is incredibly important. So we're feeling, we're experiencing, we're knowing this as ourselves at the same time as we are practicing agency. We are making choices for that character. And this is, in effect, the triple whammy. Perspective taking, self-projection, agency, and this all culminates into active perspective taking. Now, one other thing, video games are fun, right? They're fun. And it's important not to underestimate the importance of fun, right? Because fun elicits our neurobiological reward system. And maybe, just maybe, by eliciting our reward system, we could extinguish those biases contributing to dehumanization and replace them with positive associations of the other. Just maybe. And so with that idea, I approached Eline Media. And now Eline Media, myself and our partner, Dr. Magna Machade at the FXB Center in Harvard, are looking to see if we can bring this idea to reality. So could video games be used to lessen the gap between Roma and non-Roma communities? Maybe. The thing about having a great idea is that it not only illuminates the topic, but it illuminates everything else around it, right? Including all the elements, all the constraints, all the very many challenges. But just because something's tough doesn't mean that you're not going to try to do it, right? In fact, it might make it that much more interesting. And in fact, every great idea and project starts with that idea. But now that we've made friends with our elephant, we have an incredibly powerful ally. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I think it's clear that we're in a really a time of great stress, angst publicly out there, and nastiness, and where people seem, at the very least, unempathetic to hearing the other person's. In fact, they're fixed on their own position. How does the elephant and the writer even begin there? Because these people are not playing video games.
So what can we do?
What can we do?
What can we do? Who in this room has read Moral Tribes? All right, another piece of homework for you all. Yes, run out, grab Moral Tribes by Joshua Green. He's a professor at Harvard who has been trying to answer these questions his entire career. And he does a wonderful job. I'm not going to give you a scientific answer. I'm going to give you my opinion. Yeah? Slow down. Yeah? These neurobiological processes happen at an incredibly quick rate. We often go with our emotions. We often block out the other. We're not quite listening because we're already there on the other side. Yeah? And Joshua Green likens this process. I'm going to move from the elephant to a different analogy. He likens this process to the camera, right? He says we're working with a digital camera, right? It's very fast. It seems to be really great. It's super useful in the moment. It comes up with beautiful pictures. But when we're dealing with these kind of challenges, isn't particularly useful. We need to go to manual. We need to stop for a moment, and that means bringing these processes to the writer, bringing these processes to our conscious awareness. And then sometimes when we're talking about bias and dehumanization and not quite connecting with the other with a capital O, right? Sometimes just bringing these processes to our conscious awareness is enough to permanently change them. Not always, but sometimes it is. So I would say, slow down. Make friends with your elephant. Give some power to your writer.
As it happens, I was in Budapest last December,
Yeah.
and so I saw the impact of this long-held biases against Roma communities is
Yeah.
really quite devastating. I wonder, this is actually a personal question based on your work,
Yeah.
where do you find a moment of triumph? Because it does work in these instances when you are able to get some people together to connect. We've been talking about connection in different ways all this morning. So when you finally can get those people in place to do that, you know, I've seen that work, but it's just getting them there. I'd love for you to share, because we like uplift, a moment of triumph after someone's experienced the video game or the when it finally clicked for people who have been looking at each other across a great divide.
Oh my goodness gracious.
Just one story.
I know. Actually, you know what? For the story of triumph, I'm going to bring us to India for a moment. I'm going to bring us back to that slide from Pradhan. So I traveled to India to start to look at their self-help groups and the processes that build empowerment, right? And I went and I met these tribal women. And it was incredibly heart-wrenching. One woman told the story that her husband wouldn't let her come to the self-help group, that he was threatening to beat her to death. And finally she sat on the floor, and knowing that perhaps she was at death's door, said, "You either need to beat me to death now, or you're going to let me go." And he let her go. And when I met these women, this was the kind of situation that many of these women were facing. And when I met these women, they had walked literally 30 miles to come and meet me. And their stories of triumph were overwhelming. As they sat in this circle, you could feel the empowerment resonating off of them. You could feel the way that they had stopped that child marriage. You could feel the way that they had brought in economic gain and the way that they had translated empowerment into food stability. It was absolutely amazing. And quite frankly, I thought to myself, good Lord, if they can overcome those kind of obstacles, what is my excuse?
Great way to end. Thank you so much,
Thank you
Laura
so much.
Ligouri,
Thanks.
the rider and the elephant.